Welcome back. Hope you're enjoying this. We're going to learn some ways and techniques, I hope, tonight to go beyond the self that does not exist
Hmm.
to what we don't know. So
Well,
stay
wish us good
tuned.
luck. Yeah, stay
Take it
tuned is
away,
right. Yeah,
Joshua.
we'll see. So it's really nice to see everyone. I'm going to do a little bit of review because we've been many places already on this voyage in this online course. And I think a little bit of repetition helps. But just to frame our discussion today before we take questions, and I hope excite everyone a little bit, we are going to talk a lot about meditation. We're not going to meditate together as a class on Zoom, especially with YouTube recordings. That doesn't make a lot of sense. People would just fast forward. And there are plenty of wonderful places to learn to meditate, both online and, of course, in person, wherever you are. But at least we can give some framework for the kind of work that meditation does and why it actually has everything to do with what we were discussing last class about changing how we relate to this appearance of a self that we're also confident exists. Okay, so meditation is coming. If you'll bear with me, please, let's do just a wee bit of review to frame what we've done in our first three sessions, and then we're off and running. All right. So we started by talking about the Four Noble Truths, right, a few times ago. We were explaining how if we're thinking about, right, the gradual path to spiritual awakening or the slow path to spiritual awakening, this is the framework that's really common in different Buddhist traditions, recognizing the pervasiveness of suffering, the problem of our responses, our emotional responses to the reality in particular of change, and the insubstantiality of a lot of things that we pretend are substantial, or the instability of a lot of things that we pretend are stable. So in those responses, we make things worse. That's the cause of suffering. But then the good news, as we've mentioned a couple of times, is that because we make things worse, it's possible to end those causes, right? The very fact that we participate in our own suffering in this sense is good news because we can cut it out, if only it was so simple. Okay.
Mhm.
So then one of the things that we added in the second week on karma, which has to do with the actions that we carry out, physical actions, verbal actions, and mental actions, right, works in two ways. And both of them have to do with this third kind of suffering, the suffering of conditions that we see here at the bottom, which is just one of many different descriptions in old Buddhist texts about why suffering is so pervasive. So to say karma, the fact that before this moment, whether it was 5 minutes ago, it was last night, it was when we were 12 years old, or from the perspective of Buddhist teachings, lifetimes and lifetimes ago, we've been generating habits. Anytime you do something, you're more likely to do it again. But what we don't often notice is those habits aren't just physical habits. I dance in a certain way. They're not just verbal habits. I say like every third word, or I apologize too much. We have all of our verbal tics, right? But also our mental habits, which means that the habituality of our experience extends to our perceptions. This is a big deal, including, by the way, building on last week, our perceptions of ourself. So we'll come back to that. So one of the reasons that this is suffering is that we're unstable insofar as we're not in control at all of our experiences, insofar as that we're already stuck in these ruts of past experiences that in a way we've inherited from our past. And by the way, that means we never know what's coming because we've all been living long lives, which means there's a lot of actions. There are a lot of causes that have yet to come to fruition. But also, lest we're not scared enough yet, right? We see in the third form of the suffering here, the suffering of conditions, our activities now continue to influence our futures, right? They perfume our future. They make imprints on our future, not just on what happens to us, obviously, right? This is just a cup of tea. Please don't be scandalized. But let's say dumped a bunch of vodka in here, right? Or whiskey. Obviously, if I just sip now, I'd be fine. But then by the end of this class, right, maybe the effects of this action of drinking whiskey on Zoom, again, I promise I'm not doing so, would come to fruition. But also it might come to fruition tomorrow morning when I have a headache. Or it might lead to the effect of tomorrow morning I'm grumpy with my kids, or I say something unsensitive to my colleague, or I'm spacing out and I bump into somebody on the subway, and then who knows what all the effects would be. Okay, so we don't need to get lost in the story, but just to say that karma, our constant churning of activity, which is inevitable, brings with it our future suffering. And yet, all of this is good news in that we can change with attention, and this will come up today, with attention to our actions, not just our current experiences, but our future experiences, right? Which means that if our past actions are having an impact on how we see and perceive and understand the world now, then by shifting those mental habits, including, by the way, not to give the game away, through meditation practice, we can actually slowly but surely train ourselves to see things differently. For example, from last week, we can start to see a world without ourself at the center of it. So we're going to work on this. So in any event, this is a discussion now of the four truths briefly, pulling in the karma piece, which we're going to need again, right? And we mentioned that we have these habitual responses, which themselves are a product of our karma. The reason that we see certain colors or certain foods or hear certain sounds and or generate desire, right? You can think about your favorite music, right? You instinctively generate a certain amount of desire, what you think is happiness, right? When you hear it. Why? Because of your past actions, right? Or your past habituation. And even, by the way, if it's a beautiful piece, a sonata that you love, right? That's also your desire and enjoyment and attachment to that piece might be sowing future suffering because then you're in the supermarket and you can't stand the music that's playing, or you're spending time with your family or your grandkids, and maybe you love their music, but maybe you don't love their music. You see, right? We're sowing future suffering. Okay. But the big piece that we added to last class is it's not just the world is made up of these elements of change and instability. It's not just that we make things worse with these instinctive habitual responses from our karma, but also our karmic habits involve misunderstanding. That's what the ignorance piece is. Ignorance about karma, we've just talked about that every so briefly. We don't even notice the habits that we're always forming, and we're not aware of the habits from when we were younger or from when, we were in a past life, of course. But also we have ignorance about self. And this pertains to our perception of the world because we're never just perceiving, as I said, your laptop, you're always perceiving the laptop with respect to yourself. You're never just perceiving your image, for example, on the Zoom screen. You're perceiving it vis-a-vis your own self-identity and your attachment that coming across in this way, that way, or the other way. And this goes on and on and on. Even very mundane things we're perceiving vis-a-vis ourselves. Why? Because we're habituated to do so. And the idea is this is inevitably going to lead us into the desire, attachment, aversion, anger cycle. That's the story. So the point here is then that we have to investigate, right? I mean, we don't have to do anything, I always joke. But the point is, from the perspective of the path, there's an investigation. And the investigation has to do with whether our instinctive habits, which are mental habits, I mean, they're physical habits. You shower every day and you feed yourself. And they're verbal habits. How many times do you say in your mind or to other people, me, I, Josh, right? I mean, all the time. But fundamentally, these are perceptual and therefore mental habits. Perceiving the world is made up of stuff out there, good, bad, or neutral, and me, the one experiencing them, getting them, running from them, and so on, right? So then the point here is that there's a process of looking into the truth of this. Is, in fact, a self singular? We spent a lot of time on this. We assume that we're singular. That's what it means to have a self. Well, maybe it doesn't hold that well when you start looking at examples. Are we lasting? Of course, that's what it means to be a self. Does it really hold, right? Are we independent? That's what it means to be a self. And we'll see in a minute, right, when we return to a Buddhist text, right? Sometimes this implies that we have control. What it means that I'm independent from you is I'm the one who can do the speaking. So there's a little bit of a social pressure for me to keep on speaking when there's an awkward pause because I have a role that's assigned by society and Sister Maria was kind enough to invite me to talk, etc., right? But obviously I have some control over speaking or not speaking. That's why it's me, right? Who is the one talking right now and not muted and not you. You get the idea. But when you start looking at this, the independence at any moment isn't what we think it is. At the very least, my independent decision to speak is influenced by the social context, as well as my facility with English language, my past experiences forming, I hope, more or less coherent English sentences, speaking about content that I hope is more or less coherent because I've gone to graduate school or other things. You see what I'm suggesting? So even what I claim to be my independence, right? My facility and knowledge of Buddhist teachings is itself just made up of a soul set of dependent phenomenon. Okay, So this is a huge topic that we're going to continue to investigate, but this in a way is the project. And the reason it's this project is because, right, this self that we assume is singular, lasting, independent, as some combination of our body and these various facets of our thinking, is the one who perceives the world as good, bad, or neutral, and therefore worthy of desire, craving, thirst, attachment, aversion, anger, jealousy, pride, suffering, right? This is the story. It's all wrapped up together. Okay. How are we doing so far? Any brief questions anyone wants to dump into the chat? Feel free. I'll do my best to address. But what I want to now introduce is the facet of meditation, which is perhaps what most people here are most curious about. It's very common in my college class, right? That people are most curious about that. Now, there are many forms of Buddhism, excuse me, many forms of meditation. We're not going to get lost in a discussion of the diversity of meditation, as we've hinted at when talking about the diversity of Buddhist practice, although I promise you it's very true. Okay. But regardless, the necessity of some kind of disciplined practice of the mind where you not only train your mental habits, but look at yourself while you're training your mental habits. There's a name for this we'll introduce. It's called mindfulness. You've probably heard. So not only the training of your mental habits, but the looking at yourself while you're training mental habits is really essential to all forms of the path to liberation. Everyone acknowledges it's necessary. So we'll explain a little bit why and some broad categories that you can learn more about if you like, with my help if you want more resources after this class is over, or just out in the wide world of meditation instruction, which is really quite robust. At least you'll have some vocabulary. That's the job here. Ready? Okay. By the way, I won't be the only one talking. We're going to try to use some video if Zoom behaves. All right. Let's introduce these categories. All right. Forms of meditation. I hope that's what you're looking at. Please scream at me if it's the other slides. Okay, so we're going to discuss briefly three broad forms of meditation that are interrelated. There are many others. I'm going to try to go slowly. So if we don't get to the mindfulness material today or we don't finish it, no problem. We have plenty of time in our last week to introduce it, in addition to doing some Buddhist storytelling, which I think will be a fun way to end this mini semester. Okay, but in any event, we're going to talk about concentration, the necessity of concentration, then the application of concentration to what's called insight. Believe it or not, we were practicing insight last week insofar as we were discussing the topic of no self. So that's coming back for better or for worse. And then mindfulness, which is really a skill that's necessary for both. So let's start with what people often assume is all meditation is about, which is concentration practice. So there's many terms for this. We're going to call this for the next moment tranquility practice or calming practice, which is a translation of the term samatha, or sometimes occurred as shamatha. This is really, really crucial, and I'll try to explain to you why with a video or two. One cannot simply, through desire or craving or willpower or making a promise to someone else, just calm down. As we all know, there's nothing more infuriating than being angry about something, right? And then the person you're speaking to tells you to calm down. I mean, maybe there's some more infuriating things in the world, but you have to admit that's a pretty bad one, right? But it's also just terrible advice, right? Because what happens when you try to calm down? You get more agitated. You're yelling at yourself or thinking the thoughts, oh, calm down, calm, right? It's not possible, right? In fact, the nature of our mind is proliferate thoughts and respond to things, right? So calming isn't something you can just achieve through willpower. It's why I always joke in my classes, but it's true, right? Like many things in the Buddhist path, meditation does not follow the New Year's resolution model. It just doesn't work that way, right? And yet, thank goodness, human beings came up with strategies to trick our minds into calming down. It's not exclusively Buddhists who did so, but there's some very common Buddhist adaptations of these tricks. So the first one is samatha meditation, which is actually the goal. The calming or the concentration part of it is the goal of the practice. It's not the technique. The technique is really quite simple. In fact, it's hard because it's so stupidly simple. And that's single point of concentration. The way that this works is you trick your mind into calming down by itself. If you think you're calming down, It's never going to work ever, 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 ever. But you can trick your mind into calming down by focusing on just one thing. Easier said than done, but this is the most common form of introductory practice. You pick an object. In theory, it does not matter what the object is, as long as you stick to it. So very commonly, people focus on their breath, but that's a little bit too complicated. So then people focus on this feeling of the breath going in their nostrils and out of their nostrils, or the feeling of their abdomen moving up and down. Or you pick something to look at, like the color blue, right? You go to the wood shop. I always joke, but this seemed to be the strategy way back when in the old polytext. You paint a board blue, you stick it in front of you, and you stare at it. That's it, blue. By the way, you're not learning anything about blue, nor are you achieving some sense of spiritual well-being by noticing your breath, because then you are focusing on at least two things: your breath and your goal for spiritual calm. The blue and the nature of blue or the meaning of blue or something like that. That's not samatha. We can get to that later if you like. The point is sticking to one thing. And inevitably, what's going to happen, whether it's a candle flame or a sound, the mantras have to do with repetitive chants in Buddhist tradition, whether it's your breath, color blue, black, red, whatever it is you are going to be distracted, primarily by your thinking, which is normal. Now, for us goal-oriented folks, which maybe I hope isn't all of us, but it's the United States for many of us here, right? For us goal-oriented folks, one of the things that's most distracting is our own self-judgments. Am I doing a good job? Did I pick the right object? Am I listening to the professor properly? Should I have found a better YouTube video? Am I a good meditator because I'm using a meditation app? Or am I a bad meditator? Should I be paying more for my meditation app? Would my meditation be good? That kind of thing, right? And again, without getting kind of too lost in my own neurotic game here, my performance, which I know is not what you signed up for, it really is true. This is totally common. Everyone does this. And ironically, right, even though maybe the particularity of our neurosis in 2025 is a little different, there's plenty of evidence from meditation manuals dating back to the time of the Buddha that people always have made this mistake, right? So the instruction of samatha is so simple. And again, you can find better places for it. Maybe I'll do some links to appear below the YouTube when this recording appears for kind of famous meditation teachers teaching samatha. But the idea is so simple, right? When you notice yourself getting distracted, which is always, you just come back to the one object, right? It's actually intentionally boring. That's why it works. So we're going to focus on this. Let me see if there are any other slides we need just briefly for the samatha, and then I want to show you some examples of teachers explaining why it works. Why what works? Well, if you focus for long enough on one thing and just keep on coming back to the sensation of breath in your nose, or to the feeling of your abdomen, or the color blue, or the candle flame, but you only get to do one, and you got to keep on coming back. Boring, boring, boring. Then what slowly happens is things fall away. Your mind calms down on its own. Thinking falls away. It's not that it never appears, but it's not so distracting. Usually what happens when you're meditating is you think of like, oh, am I been meditating too long? Because I still need to eat dinner, right? Am I going to get a headache because I didn't eat dinner? Did I eat the right thing for dinner? Oh, there's a sale at Stop and Shop. And then, you're down the road thinking about your credit card bill or whether you should move out of a metropolitan area like where I live because it's too expensive, although that's probably everywhere, right? This is very common, right? But the idea is not that you never have the thought, when is my meditation going to end? Or I'm hungry. It's just that it's not distracting to you, partially because of the skill of mindfulness, but we'll come back to that. Okay. But the idea is slowly things fall away. And this is the crazy part. Actually, you'll hear some brief reference to this in a second. Your sensory experience falls away. So you'll hear a reference, if we get that far in the video, to no longer feeling your body at all. This is not a metaphor. What happens is your body disappears. Your visual apparatus stops. You no longer hear anything. Now, this does not mean that if someone was in the room with you, you suddenly vaporize. That's not what your body disappearing is. But the point is that through disciplined practice, literally your mind no longer has perceptions. This, by the way, is not liberation, but it's the level of concentration required to do some of the work we're going to get to in the second half of this discussion. So let's listen to Ajahn Brahm talk about this a little bit. He's going to be the our teacher here from the Thai forest tradition. He's a very popular teacher in English, as you'll see, talking through a little bit. You'll see a picture of him on YouTube, but it's not a video, it's an audio recording, explaining why this works. And it's just a taste, right? And I can link to the video if you want to hear more of him. All right, so wish me good luck. I always get nervous at this point because of my self-habit and attachment to whether or not the video works.
Now I held a cup up and I asked, can you please tell me when it becomes still? And the more you hold it, the harder you try, the more it moves. The only way to get a cup of water still is to put it down.
So can you guys hear the video? Yeah? Okay, so he's saying this is a metaphor, but then it's going to be quite literal. He's saying, look, if you want the water in the cup, I should have brought one, right? To stop, our instinct is hold really tightly, right? Right? You imagine like, you used to play those games where you put the egg on the spoon and walk, right? Like really focus so you don't drop the thing. But we all know that's a disaster. It doesn't work, right? But he says it's so silly. You just put the cup on the table. It'll stop on its own. Okay, so now he's going to explain why this metaphor is appropriate.
To let it go and it becomes still all by itself. It's the nature of this water to be still. Only when I hold it does it shake. It's the nature of your mind to be still. Only when you grasp it does it move.
Okay, so obviously he continues here, and you guys can return to this video if you like. But just to make sure it's really clear what he's suggesting, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's actually a lot counterintuitive. It feels like I'm imagining, and excuse me for projecting my own neurosis for the third time today, that our minds are anything but calm by nature, right? Because when we're doing anything, we have the judgments and the self-judgments and the judgments of others. And even if we're having a nice time, how long does it take before we're enjoying an ice cream or a cup of tea or a wonderful discussion amongst your friends, right? Or whatever it might be, or a service, right? Before you notice that you're enjoying it, and then you think, oh, I hope that this lasts for longer, right? Or it was better 10 minutes ago, right? Again, I assume that some of us are a little bit skillful with enjoyment, right? We've been around the block, but you recognize how it seems like we will interfere in a sense with all of our, right, even most treasured moments. This doesn't suggest a calm mind, but the argument, and you find this in different forms of Buddhist tradition, and this gets a little bit sophisticated in the different arguments that people make, but it's pretty common in Buddhist traditions. There's a recognition that there's at least a facet of our minds that is just by nature calm. And the argument is it must be the case because people do all this meditation and it works. What works? We trick ourselves into focusing on one thing, right? And the focusing on one thing has nothing to do with the thing. It does not matter if it's a candle flame or the color blue. It's just that when you focus for long enough, all of the thinking, the distraction settles just like a cup. So he hasn't explained why this is going to happen, but we're going to get a little bit of that in the second video. But this is the pitch. And look, I'm not trying to sell you on anything, but he's definitely right about this. I mean, plenty of people, Buddhists, non-Buddhists, of all different traditions, atheists, agnostics, yeah. I mean, and people of different religious traditions, Catholic traditions, I'm sure Protestants, the whole business, right? Human beings of all shapes and sizes have done meditation practice and can attest to this working. It's hard because it's so boring. You can't multitask to follow this strategy. It doesn't work. You can't be efficient. You can't do it more quickly. You can't do three things at once, right? You can't be good at it because if you're good at it, you are actually focusing on one object like the candle flame and thinking, good at it. You see? That's two things, right? In any event, I'm sure some of you have done meditation practice, you know what I mean. Like this is a little bit tricky, right? It sounds simple, but it's really not. Not because it's complicated, because it's just tenacious, let's say. What's tenacious? One thing you see, mental habits, right? If you don't believe in karma now, try meditating. You have no idea where these thoughts are coming from, right? And yet there they are. Okay. So Nathan, I don't want me to pitch too hard, but in any event, there's something here. Let's hear though Ajahn Brahm's talking about what we might consider to be even more ambitious, which is the fact that it's not just that if you focus on one thing for long enough, things will fall away, which by the way, I'm sure everyone has experiences of this. If you like to paint or you like to sing or you like to write or you take walk, I mean, plenty of people have this experience. It's not Buddhist, it's just human. If you're really focused, things fall away, right? Okay. But let's see how far this goes in a couple explanations, one of which is quite funny. I know it's funny because he starts laughing. He thinks it's hilarious. Let's see what happens. I just want to make sure I'm in the right place. Okay.
Because what happens when things are still, they disappear. Have you ever noticed that when there's a sound of, say, the fans, now you can hear it. Maybe a minute or two ago you weren't conscious of it. Because the sound doesn't change, our mind stops hearing it. Our brain is only wired to notice things which change.
Okay, so there are a couple points to come here, but this is an obvious one. I always joke with my students in the city, right? If like you are going to school in Manhattan, right, and you didn't grow up in the city, you sleep terribly the first week because it's loud outside, even with the windows closed. But then you learn. You don't learn by trying. Your mind just adapts. But then if your family comes to visit you, they think you're crazy. How could anyone ever sleep here? Right? But what happens is your mind gets habituated. This is just mental karma. Your mind gets habituated so you don't notice. But that doesn't mean if something strange comes up, you don't hear it, right? Like if there's, God forbid, like a shot or I don't know, fireworks and you think it's a shot or whatever. I mean, come up with your own example, right? Or someone comes into the room all of a sudden. It's really crazy. It's so noisy outside. There's not just the din, but the people yelling, the whole thing. You don't wake up. And then someone just squeaks your door open a little bit and you wake up if you have that experience, right? What's the idea? The idea is, and this is his argument, I can't provide the neuro explanation here, but the idea is that our minds are attuned to shifts and changes. So again, if you are in an environment, and this means you have to be in an environment that's relatively stable, at least for a little while, which is why people used to go out to the middle of the forest or to a cave to meditate. But in theory, if you're just focusing on one thing so boringly, coming to the same thing over and over and over again, and then you're just focusing on that thing, then all of the other experience just falls away because nothing's happening. He's going to give you this example of looking at your eyelids in a second. And then he gives a really funny story about this. So let's see if this still works. I hope it will.
If they are still, they disappear. And a good example, when you do meditate and you close your eyes, you may notice what you see at first is the inside of your eyelids. It's dark. But because that does not change, after a while, your sense of seeing turns off. It stops. You're not seeing blackness anymore. You're not seeing anything. The sense of seeing has stopped. It's just a function of the brain. If you're sitting perfectly still, if nothing is moving, your body disappears. That's what's meant to happen. So many times you're sitting there and you can't feel your legs or your bottom or your hands or anything. That's fine. That's what's supposed to happen because nothing is moving, it vanishes. Listen, there was a Malaysian couple.
All right, this story is great because he thinks it's hilarious. You could decide on your own if it's hilarious. But what we're going to get now is not just simply the fact that when there's nothing changing, things fall away, but also an explanation that I think we all can identify with. I hope not too much, but a little bit with about how single point concentration really works. When you're really focused on one thing, literally the world disappears. All right, everyone ready? Okay.
Living in Perth. And they told me once they were so focused on the movie they were watching at home, that everything else disappeared. They were totally focused on the movie. And once the movie was finished, one of them went up to go to the toilet. The other one went up to make a cup of tea. And only when they got up, they noticed that several things were missing from their house. Even just behind them, many things had disappeared. And they soon realized a burglar had been into the house and had actually been right behind them and taking things from the shelf right behind them. And they hadn't heard anything. You know why? Because they were totally focused on the movie. And everything else had disappeared. This is how things disappear. When the mind is focused and still on one thing, everything disappears.
Okay, so you could see, I think it's both hilarious, but also hilarious how funny he thinks it is that these folks got robbed. But we can identify with this, especially, by the way, with TV. I always use the example you can consider when you go to the movie theater, right? I mean, is there anything more distracting than a movie theater? People are eating popcorn and slurping. I mean, hopefully not making phone calls and texting. But like in the old days, even without that stuff, Twizzlers, and Twizzlers not the easiest things to eat, right? And like, I mean, nowadays you get fancy chairs, but even still, they're not that comfortable. It's like dirty, maybe a little sticky from people spilling their Diet Coke. I mean, you guys have been to movie theaters, right? But what happens? If it's a good movie, that's the magic of the movies, right? You don't need me to tell you, right? If it's a good movie, disappears. If it's a boring movie, so uncomfortable. Like, will you just be quiet there? Like, why are the people chatting behind me, right? And so on and so forth, right? Like, oh, I don't like this theater. The screen isn't big enough or something, right? Okay, so this is the idea here. Questions so far you can put in the chat if you like. We're going to try to keep on going. But the point is single point concentration really works. And it's training of focus. And the idea of things falling away is not because the falling away itself is liberation, though it helps. Because otherwise, because of our karma, but also just if you think about our busy lives and the demands on us, it's too much. You can't sort through everything in the systematic way we need to sort through them when we're playing the no self game, which you're all thinking, not that again, but it's coming back, right? It's not possible to sort through these things unless we really train our minds and focus. And this is part of the idea. This is why in pretty much every form of Buddhist tradition, there's some treatment of meditation. There's some other kind of adaptations, but basically the recognition of the necessity of concentration. And the miracle is this works. And you don't have to be Buddhist for it to work, because you don't even have to be committed to the path of overcoming attachment to self. Just relax. It really does work. And I should just say, for my 2 cents, it's harder than sometimes people say, right? In our culture of advertising, right? But in any event, but the strategies really do work. Okay, so let's continue here. Thank you to Ajahn Brahm for the moment. Okay, so one thing that's really important, which I think sometimes is missed in contemporary meditation culture, not to pick on famous meditation teachers, they know, especially the ones who are trained in Buddhist traditions, but often what you get in the application of Buddhist styles of meditation is people come for the calm and then they assume that's the goal, which also I should just say leads to people making all these really bizarre conclusions about Buddhists being calm, relaxed human beings, which is absurd. Buddhists are human beings, right? Period. Just, right? But in any event, people kind of have this kind of funny mix, like, oh, I get Buddhists don't care about anything. They're calm, they're relaxed because they must meditate all day. This is nonsense. They're real human beings. But it is the case that some people who are meditation masters and dedicate themselves to this craft can literally slow down their responses. What kind of responses? I don't mean that their life goes in slow motion, but when you're focused and you're attentive to what's arising and then coming back to focusing on what you're focusing on, you're less likely to get carried away by your habitual behavior, which includes getting carried away by the habits of, you guys know the drill by now, you're probably sick of it, judgment, desire, craving, attachment, jealousy, pride, the whole business. You see how this goes? Okay, but even still, calm isn't sufficient. Rather, calm is in service of vipassana, which translates quite literally to insight, seeing into something, seeing thoroughly. And I always suggest what it means to do vipassana, which is why it's usually understood to be a form of meditation, is that it's insight that is so thorough it transforms how you see. So it's very different to watch a YouTube video on double speed about no self from exploring your relationship to one facet of your body over and over again in an organized fashion. Explore the complicated relationships you just have, for example, to your face. Are you your face? Does the face belong to you? Right? Is your face singular? Is it lasting? Is it changing? Is it independent? Right? I'm just thinking about this because we can all see our own faces here, or you can look in the mirror, right? So then having some kind of organized practice of focus. But what's honestly going to happen for most of us if we stand in front of the mirror to do a face meditation, which isn't exactly a traditional meditation, but it's not far from one, right? You're going to get distracted. You're going to say, oh man, I need to get a haircut, right? Or I should shave, or I should brush my teeth, or oh, who's that guy? Or like, hey, who's that? That's a good looking guy, or whatever it might be, right? But it's, you can imagine, like, it's just very hard to focus, which is why samatha is preparatory. And the claims in some traditions about how much samatha you need to do, how much calming is remarkable, right? There's claims that you can sit for long enough that everything falls away and you get to these really subtle mental states that are blissful, and then the bliss falls away and you're just in abstract empty space, and then you're confronting consciousness as such. I mean, it gets really interesting. And the point is not necessarily that by slowing things down you are going to get to liberation, as if liberation is a goal, but rather that sufficient mastery of concentration is necessary to go all the way that we're going to have to go in a minute with insight. This is what I mean by preparatory. Okay, so preparatory for what? Well, there's many different versions of what this insight is that transforms how you see. That transforms how you see, I always joke. It's like, I think maybe we talked about this in the last session. Like, once you know for certain that Santa Claus doesn't exist, then when you go to the mall and you see Santa Claus differently, right? Right? It's just going to totally transform your experience, right? Same thing with like once you understand how electricity works or gravity works or otherwise. All right. So what are we generating insight into? Oh, look at this, right? The method to the madness. Many of the things we've already been talking about, right? Karma. And here I don't just mean the abstract principle of karma, but rather noticing how habits do create our experience, for example, which takes a lot of attention. Focus. If you're learning about your habitual mental, physical, verbal habits and recognizing whether they're positive, negative, or otherwise, this is going to take discipline. This is no longer single point concentration because you're focusing on a whole bunch of stuff, right? Moment to moment, but it's still going to take some kind of focused discipline. So here, some kind of insight into karma. Usually this isn't its own category as such, but there are many forms of meditation that would fall into this. Another classic example from old texts is focusing on the four truths, right? That we've covered. So insight meditation involves literally meditating on the four truths. Again, this doesn't mean that you like pull up the text or like pull out your book, memorize it, although people do memorize it, and meditate on the book with the four truths in it, right? Or like the audible audiobook version of it, but rather you are meditating on each of the principles. So you suggest, okay, I'm going to explore the nature of suffering. I'm going to explore the suffering that emerges from changing phenomenon. That's it for the next 6 months of my life, right? Or whatever it might be if you're organized. I'm going to be principled. I'm going to make a list of a couple things that generate happiness in me, and I'm going to reflect how their changing and unstable nature is going to lead to future suffering. You have to be systematic about it. You see how this goes? Now, this is unpleasant. That's why concentration and focus is preparatory and necessary. Does this make sense? Okay, but in any event, so sometimes the four truths themselves are the path, meaning focusing on the reality of each of these steps, right? And we haven't covered them all four, but you can at least get the principle. Meditation on suffering and its causes and what happens when those causes end itself can be insight meditation, but only if addressed with focus. This is conceptual. People often think meditation doesn't involve thinking, right? Totally wrong. Many, many different forms of meditation in Buddhist traditions are quite conceptual. It's just that they're not like, oh, whatever comes to my mind conceptual. You see what I mean? And they're not even free writing conceptual, focused, imagining, looking, observing. Okay. And again, there's different strategies of this. All right, so then the next one, which is also really common, and both the four truths and the three marks, which we introduced briefly last time, I'm going to review, are classic examples of the kinds of things that if you meditate on with focus, literally get you liberated. I'm going to try to prove that to you in a second, which is like this, that was the goal that we were getting to at the end of last class. So what are the three marks? They are the nature of impermanence, things are changing. They're the nature of suffering, that things don't bring lasting satisfaction, even the things we like, and the big one, no self. So I told you it was coming back. Meditation on no self in just about every Buddhist tradition, even though there are different strategies, is central to getting liberated. Again, it only works if you can look at it honestly. I don't want to say objectively because that word has all sorts of connotations and are kind of a scientific materialist culture. But the idea is that if you can't maintain sustained focus on the object of your inquiry, your body or your face or whatever it is, your memory of childhood or whatever it might be, right? Then you're never going to be able to figure out if it makes sense to call that yourself. And you're also, more importantly, you're never going to notice the habit of assuming that's yourself, right? You're not going to notice it in the moment if you're not practiced and focused. That's the pitch. Okay, now let's get some happy news here. I want to keep on moving. And then we'll hopefully get a little taste of mindfulness. That'll be a preview maybe for next week. All right, so I'm going to share with you a tricky text. We're not going to read the whole thing, but as a college professor, I feel guilty that we haven't done this yet. That's my suffering. Okay, this is what's called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta. A sutta is just a discourse, you can see that, or a sermon attributed to the Buddha. We already talked about his first discourse. That's where we got the four truths. Okay, so this is, I don't know if it's a second discourse, but lo and behold, this is a very famous one, talking to these Panchavagi, the five brethren, which is these old buddies of his, literally. I think I joked about this before. They're his old meditation buddies, but he didn't like how they were meditating. They're meditating by trying to eliminate desire by basically starving themselves. And he said, that's not going to fly. Okay, so in any event, so he's talking to them. He says, thus I've heard on one occasion, that's not the Buddha, that's his student, saying he heard that the Blessed One, that's a Buddha, was hanging out near Varanasi, right? At the deer refuge, right? And he was talking to this group of five monks. It's the same guys that he was talking to during the Four Truths pitch. Okay, and then what does he tell them? He lays out an insight story. I'm not going to go through the whole argument. We don't have time for that. Okay, but this in a way is what we were looking at last time. You say, well, if you're going to look for a self, we got to look in an organized fashion. Let's consider form, which in this case just means material things, which if you're looking for yourself, the material place you look for yourself is your body. So then he asks you all these questions about your body. Can you really control it? Is it independent? Does it bring you happiness? And then he asks that in a similar way about feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness. We're not going to go into the details, but these are old classic categories of our mental experience. And the basic argument is going to be, look, we don't control any of these things. None of these things is a good candidate for self because none of them is independent at all. Then he's going to go back to these categories and he's going to say, look, you look at them, they're all constantly changing. So our body and various facets of our mental experience, they're not good candidates for self because we think we last and none of those things last. And by the way, and he really lays it on thick, nice guy, because we don't control these things and because they're changing, you can see where the punchline is. These things, which we take such pride in as our important, cherished self, just make us miserable. So it's like, by the way, this is the insulting piece. It's not so much only that we've made a mistake, but it's that very attachment to these changing things that hopelessly make us unhappy. Okay, so this is the pitch. This sounds unhappy, right? Or difficult, but actually it's quite the opposite because look what happens. This is why I'm showing it to you. Through this process of insight, he goes through these steps, but in theory, most people who aren't his old five buddies and don't pick up that quickly have to go through a long extended process of first single point concentration, right? Focusing, and then learning to systematically look into, generate insight into these realities. But what happens at the end? I'll read it to you. Seeing thus, the well-instructed disciple, I don't know if that's you guys, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones grows disenchanted with all of these different categories of self. What does that mean? Disenchanted means You simply don't generate attachment to your own body and your mental experiences in the same way. Why? We habitually are attached to ourselves. It's literally what it means to perceive ourselves. But through systematic meditation, meaning over and over again looking and realizing that our assumptions don't make sense, you generate new mental karma. You're generating habits of seeing. Remember, I mentioned this earlier? It's possible to change our perception of reality. This is crazy, but that's the pitch. Through slow, careful, focused concentration efforts, it is possible to rewire our perceptions. I always joke in class, I feel bad saying this on a YouTube recording, but I always joke, this is the process of brainwashing yourself. But it's brainwashing yourself with the truth. That's the way that the insight tradition thinks about it. But it's still brainwashing because the truth itself doesn't set you free. If only it was so nice, right? The truth sets you free through habituating yourself to it. That's what meditation means. Habituating, becoming familiar with. But over and over again, you change your relationship to your body. By the way, we all have had this experience, especially as we all age, right? I mean, we all know that your experience of yourself is changing. I mean, I assume we're all somewhat attached to ourselves because we're alive, but I'm sure that everyone's relationship here is different to their body because you habituate yourself to a different relationship to it, right? This happens naturally. Okay. But here the idea is to be systematic. Also, not only about your body, but your various mental processes. Okay. So this is the important thing here. This is the good news. We haven't gone to the good news yet because you're saying be disenchanted or disengaged with myself. That sounds terrible. Maybe. But what the pitch is that only by doing this do you become dispassionate, which again is a tricky translation because it sounds miserable, but it's actually the opposite of that. It's an accurate translation, of course, right? When you are disenchanted, you become dispassionate. What does that mean? You do not respond to the world as if it's things that you need to get or things you need to reject. It's that whole desire, attachment, craving stuff. This is the only reason it's going to stop. The desire, craving, attachment. Because if we perceive the world as for us, good for us or bad for us, and by the way, I don't mean this that we're selfish. We just perceive the world this way. Look, good for us could mean good for all of humanity, right? Or all of God's children. Like maybe, I'm sure many people are quite generous in this group. It's fine. But it's still a mistake in the sense that you are perceiving the phenomenon as fundamentally on their own side, good or bad for the human beings. And therefore we should get them or push them away. We just think this way. It seems so obvious to us. But the idea is if you stop seeing yourself through the insight habit, you will stop seeing the world as for you or against you. And then the passion drops. What did I mean by passion? Desire, craving, attachment, pride, jealousy, anger, aversion. And I think you see where this is going. Full release, liberation. There's nothing else to do. That's the claim. So this is quite literally a liberation story, right? So you get liberation stories about insight into the four truths and then insight into the three marks. Okay, this is what Vipassana is. And I mention this, but just so that we're really, really clear about this. Why do you need to meditate to do this and not just take the exam or write a book? And, I'm speaking as an academic, as there are some people in this group here, right? I'm not saying trash the books. By the way, there's plenty of Buddhist scholars themselves, right? Study is very much a central part of many Buddhist traditions. But if that study isn't joined with disciplined meditation practice, which is the mental habituating, first, you're never going to be able to concentrate. Because think about it. What could be possibly as scary as looking at suffering and no self? Like that sounds miserable. Can you imagine? If that had been the pitch of the Zoom, no one would have signed up. Say, great, for 7 weeks, let's look at misery and your total absence mistake that you've been making every moment of your life that you exist. How many people would we get system where you can tell me? I hope 0. It's a terrible pitch. But actually, the idea is that if you generate the habits of concentration, you can stick with these things and something remarkable happens. It's pleasant. It's pleasurable to drop our fixation on things, right? I feel a little bit like a salesman here because what do I know? But this is the pitch of the tradition, and plenty of people, excuse me, will claim this is the case. even marginally, dropping the habits of viewing things in terms of ourself allows us to just relax. By the way, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be all right. That's not the point. This is not a political program. It's not even a program of universal salvation, although we'll get that next semester if we do it and if you guys come back in the spring. But it's rather a loosening. Do you see what I mean by that? It's a loosening that can only come through habituating our mind over and over and over again. And that loosening leads to liberation. There just isn't suffering on the other end of it. That's the pitch. It's a pretty big pitch. Okay, so another taste, and then I think plenty of time to do some questions, right? All right, so we need meditation because we got to learn how to concentrate. Again, no offense. I'm sure there are some wonderful concentrators in this group, right? But the idea is we need to all collectively get better at it, right? So we can really look suffering and no self eye to eye, face to face. That's a very common metaphor, right? And then in order for these insights to bring about change, this is the transformation piece. So very often meditation is understood to be the place where the transformation happens. You prepare by focusing and studying, and then the meditation is where the transformation happens. So it's not just that you convince yourself for the point of your end of the semester final paper for Shapiro's class, or for your brilliant conversation with each other when the Zoom is over, although I hope that you have nice conversations. That's not the point. The point is to transform how you experience the world, so much so that things loosen up, you see, and the liberation happens. Less suffering. Okay, how are we doing? The last piece I want to introduce very briefly, and then I promise we'll spend time on this next week because it's really fun, is sati or smrti. These are two related terms, one in Pali, one in Sanskrit, that's often translated as mindfulness. What mindfulness is so simple. What it can do is so profound. And how much people have gotten attached to it is hilarious. I'll promise we'll get laughs with this next week. Okay. But what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is something simple that all human beings can do. There's nothing Buddhist about this. It's simply being aware of what you're doing as you're doing. I say it's like the aware when structure, right? So in old famous texts, they say, monks, that's all of us here in this context. Hey, monks, when you're walking, be aware walking. When you're sitting, be aware sitting. When you're standing, being aware standing. When you lie down, be aware standing, is lying down. This itself is not liberation, but it's necessary. And we'll see if we have time for this, but it's necessary for concentration practice, and it's necessary for insight. Now, you can just think about this for a second. Why is this hard? It's actually a part of our hardware we make, to use a kind of an anachronistic metaphor, that our minds are capable of doing this. But honestly, you guys have been sitting there for a while. I've been sitting here for a while. Have you been aware of sitting? I mean, if you're bored, maybe. But even just sitting there, are you aware sitting? I don't mean the word sitting goes through your mind, but do you even notice that you're doing it? No, it's quite different. So you can just try this. It's very simple. As I hope you're listening or tuning out or watching, can you simultaneously listen and watch and notice yourself sitting there? Can you listen and watch while noticing yourself listening and watching? We call this reflexive or self-reflexive awareness. It's like a boomerang. You might think that you either listen or look or sit. You either listen or notice you're listening, sit or notice you're sitting, look or notice you're looking, but it's actually not how it works. It's miraculous. We're all quite capable of sati, mindfulness, bringing attention to what's happening as it's happening, to what we're doing as we're doing it, and still doing it. Now, look, it takes some getting used to. I always say, like, if you have a conversation with somebody, sometimes you ever have that conversation, you're in a deep conversation with someone, and then you notice you're having the conversation. It feels almost like an out-of-body experience. It's kind of neat, actually. And sometimes you're capable of still operating, right? You still can speak. It's kind of remarkable. But if you get self-conscious about it, right, then it gets awkward, right? But the point is you can train in doing this. Now, look, again, sati itself isn't the secret, although it is an aid to other forms of meditation. And it's become a profoundly popular strategy for meditation. Many of you have probably heard about it. And so we will talk a little bit more about why it's become so popular. and how it really is central to all of the forms of meditation, including single point of concentration or samatha and insight or vipassana. But I feel like we have so much on the table. Before I talk any longer, I thought maybe we at least briefly break here for some conversation or Q&A, and then we'll see where we land. And I promise before our time is up, next week we'll do some sati or mindfulness talk in addition to the other kind of pre-programmed material. How's everyone doing? I know there's a lot of material, right? Hopefully the recorded nature of this makes this worthwhile so people can go back and look again if you can bear spending more time with me. Any questions here on either the no self material or these different forms of meditation? I'm honestly happy to chat about anything that you guys would think would be productive.
Joshua, I think Carolyn McAndrew, did you, were you giving a thumbs up or you want to raise your hand? Just a thumbs up. Okay.
I don't mean to be like too pedantic here because it's not a college class as such, but it would be interesting to hear from you why instinctively it seems that you need concentration practice, focusing on a candle flame in order to be exploring no self. Why is meditation so central? This isn't a pop quiz, but I'm curious. You can ask questions about it or try it out yourself. Like, why is the idea of single pointed focus so important to the success of the project of looking for yourself? Is that logic fitting? Because I think without that piece, we're lost. Yeah, please, Carolyn.
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I think there's a tendency, at least in my mind, to be distracted. And by focusing in on just one thing, and I've done this before, eventually, like you said, there's things just fall away.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my experience too. Anyone else want to jump in here or ask questions about the relationship between the concentration practice and this challenging pursuit of self? Christine, please.
That's the part I was struggling
Mhm.
with, because I've always heard of meditation and the focusing on one thing, but so your framing is that's the preparatory work, and then you can move to the insight. So what does moving to the insight feel like, look like? I mean, I can concentrate, but then what do I do when everything falls away to get to insight?
Right.
Well,
Does
it's a
that
wonderful
make
question.
sense?
Yeah, and there's different, I mean, the simple college professor answer is there's different strategies. But one thing that you'll find throughout Buddhist traditions is one, study, right? One needs to prepare by memorizing texts, learning and speaking, and sometimes debating ideas, such as the four truths and the three marks and no self, but there are others as well. And then one needs a teacher. And just about every Buddhist tradition emphasizes not this kind of a teacher, I mean like a real teacher, a personal teacher, what's called a Kalyana Mitra, which is sometimes translated as a spiritual friend. So it's kind of a nice translation. Why? Because you need someone to guide you in your examination. This is the problem. If you're looking for yourself in your body or your mind, you're just going to trick yourself. We all do. You say, I found it. There it is, right? When you forget what you did the day before, right? I mean, it's like looking for your keys where you look in one room, you look in another room if you're not systematic. And it's really easy to fool ourselves. By the way, Buddhists are really worried about this. I sometimes kind of scandalize everyone in my classes by using a really famous Indian model, meditation manual that explicitly says that the biggest problem that people have if they do too much concentration practice and think that they're finding the nature of reality is that Hindus do the same thing. So again, we can be ecumenical in this room. Is that clear? But according to certain Buddhist traditions, they're not just worried about Hindu traditions or Muslim traditions or other traditions. They're worried about other Buddhists getting it wrong. You see? Because if you look for something, you might find it. Right? I mean, I don't want to ask all of you, again, scandalize everyone here, but I don't know what your prayer experiences are, but who knows? Maybe you guys found God. But from the perspective of this tradition, it's a disaster, right? I don't really think most Buddhists would say it's a disaster if you have a relationship with God, by the way, at least not in 2025, before we get in trouble here. But the point is that there really is concern that when you're applying concentration to insight, you do it correctly. Is that making sense, Christine? So what you need is a teacher, and then discipline to look one place at a time. So you got to convince yourself. I would say you got to. It seems funny because none of us have to do anything here, but we're one committed to this practice. You have to be thorough in looking at your body and every part of your body to figure out if it's lasting. And so then you get all these interesting meditations. You want to hear about meditations? People go and meditate in charnel grounds, which is our fancy word for cemeteries that aren't kept up very well because they didn't used to be kept up very well. And then you sleep there. Great. Why? Because in addition to having to face the ghosts and the spirits you're scared of in most traditional communities that were Buddhist, like you're sitting next to smelly, decaying bodies. And what's the difference between you and the smelling, decaying body sitting next to you? Only one thing. Time. That's going to be you. I mean, I hope everyone gets nice burials, but you get the idea, right? I mean, and so this is a very different way of meditating on the insubstantiality and impermanence of a body, you see? It's not only that your body's going to change, it's that between me and you, it's gross, it smells bad, can't even look at it without vomiting or being really scared. Is there anything more scary than a decaying body? I apologize to gross everyone out after dinner, but this is what I mean. These are insight practices, Christine, that people traditionally have done. I don't know if everyone does them anymore. There's other shortcuts, but this is what we mean by being systematic. So like, if you're going to really ask yourself, is my body me? What's my relationship to my body? This is what we mean. Go and look. Does that help to be a little bit of a taste?
It's even more complex than I thought.
Well, it's a
It
long
really-
process. It's a long
Yeah.
process.
Okay.
The good news is next week we'll get some shortcuts, and then next semester we'll get even more shortcuts.
Okay.
But I don't know that you can apply those shortcuts or not. That's up to you. But I mean, there are different attitudes about this. But in the traditional model, which is what we're talking about, the gradual path to spiritual awakening, it's gradual for a reason. One thing at a time. Ginny, if you have your hand, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
As a beginner, what would you suggest for how often and how long?
I thank you for the question. I don't personally really have a suggestion because I don't like present myself, especially on recording here, as a meditation instructor. I mean, I know a bit about meditation. I promise I'm not making things up, and I have some experience here, but there are plenty of people who are. So I would say the best thing to do is to meet real human beings who can give you instruction, whether that's like with an app or in person somewhere, and then you can really get like actual instruction. But so that I'm not wasting your time, I will say it's very common that people start with 5-minute sessions, especially guided sessions. But I always say this to students in my meditation class who are experimenting because people have said this to me too, and it's true. Actually, 20 minutes is easier than 5 minutes. 7 days a week is easier than 3 days a week. Twice a day is easier than once a day. Now, obviously, that's a little bit counterintuitive, but the reason people say that if you're starting with single point concentration, and I see some people nodding who've done meditation, is that remember the putting the glass down and the settling? It takes time. So if you put it down and and it doesn't settle, then you get up after 2 minutes and you're annoyed, or you're angry, or it's infuriating, or you think you're doing something wrong, which is how we all act. But if you bore yourself for 20 minutes, it's possible that the mind will settle. And by the way, sometimes people have profound experiences right off the bat, which can be good or bad because then you get attached. Sometimes it takes people forever. I don't know. Everyone has different experiences. But the point is giving yourself time, especially habituating yourself to the practice. So that's why sometimes I find with college students, they get really frustrated because they're just trying to, do 3 minutes with a guided meditation and 4 things going on at once. And then they hate it because it's hard, Whereas really, actually, it's the opposite is the case. You just kind of bore yourself. And you're starting to learn how to meditate because you're boring yourself. And then, believe it or not, things really do slow down sometimes. Okay, so that's maybe more than I should say. But the real answer is, I'd find someone who knows what they're talking about and sit with them. There are so many options for that these days. And then you can get like slightly more tailored advice. But thank you for the question. Yeah, Sister Maria.
I have a question. So you connected this everything falling away with insight. So is insight always does insight always accompany that experience,
Right.
or are there just going to be days when you are there and you have a single focus and you feel like things are falling away, but then you come out of meditation and you're like, okay, things fell away. So
The
what?
irony is that this is actually a very old debate. There's a lot of evidence about this. Sister Maria, great. I really appreciate the question. Because, and you see this guy, Ajahn Brahm, who does teach jhana meditation, which are meditations on the subtle mental states that emerge when things fall away. So I'll link to him, but he's a teacher. You can learn more about him, who thinks that there is something valuable in the insight of watching things fall away.
Wow.
But that's not really the dominant position in most Buddhist traditions. Most Buddhist traditions think samatha is helpful and it's pleasurable, which is good, keeps you motivated, right?
Mhm.
And it turns you off from the normal things you want to do, like smoking a cigarette or drinking a caffeinated beverage or whatever, eating chicken
Right.
wings or whatever, all the good stuff, right? So in a way, it's productive that way, but it's not full of insight. The falling away itself is insufficient. And their evidence is like, look, everyone in India was doing that and they didn't get liberated. In fact, that's literally the Buddha's pitch to those 5 buddies of his. He said, you can meditate all day and have things fall away. But then you come back, like Sister Maria said, and then the experience is over, and you know what you're stuck with? Not just what's around you and this like wicked world we live in, right? You know what you're stuck with? All of your past karma is still there. All of the past habits that we were worrying about are still there.
Mhm.
So actually, you need something in addition. So it's not that the insight practice itself can't be transformative. And a lot of people will testify that. Again, that's not my job to testify to this, but plenty of people will. But it's also that it's helpful to do what really matters if you care about overcoming suffering, which is the analytical piece. Again, analytical doesn't necessarily mean philosophical argumentation, although we do get a lot of that. But I mean, meditatively analytical, one step at a time, looking for self or looking at suffering or looking at change. And that's more than just the falling away, at least according to most traditions. I hope that that answers your question.
Mhm.
By the way, we could say that this is why sometimes people have powerful spiritual experiences and then they spend their whole life chasing the experience because the rest of their life doesn't change,
Mhm.
right? And for other people, they have a spiritual experience and it motivates them to take other actions and they build community, the whole business. That's great. But for some people, right, they just, like had a whether it was natural or with, mind altering substances or whatever it might be, and then, or they did a hike to some crazy place and then they spend their whole life chasing that, right? I don't mean to be anyone's therapist. I would be a terrible therapist. But this kind of idea that you can have these peak experiences, right? Where
Mhm.
like the world falls away, right? And it actually doesn't help you at all. It doesn't mean it's not significant. Is that
Right.
clear? But in of itself, it's not doing the transforming of your perceptions, which is necessary if we're going to rewire our karma. It's a big piece in most of these traditions.
So in the end, Joshua, the whole point is the 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 point towards which you go is the rewiring of karma, of actions, so that you you stop doing those things, or you stop having those perceptions about things that make you suffer.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. That's what you look at. I mean, I listen to all this, and of course, from a Christian perspective, I can't help it because this is the world and the field that
Great.
I'm in. You know, we don't. I mean, in a Christian perspective, suffering is redemptive. And I know it doesn't fit with basically what you're saying.
It's just different. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
please.
in
Mhm.
Buddhism, if I got you right, suffering is something that you should, uh, you, you can in a methodological, in applying a methodology, you can overcome that. In Christian tradition, it's so different because suffering is not something that you individually can overcome. It's something that we're taught is overcome by an outside agent, in the person of Christ. So when I listen to you, I can't, it's kind of like having explosions in my mind of what I know from the world that we were all raised in, Christianity, and basically the kinds of things that you are telling us, which, for a lot of people, uh, nobody's from the bishop's office is on this thing, I hope, but for a lot of people, what you are saying is much more attractive, helpful, personal, um, and experiential than I'm waiting for a savior outside of there to come and relieve me from my sin and death and suffering. This is a much more personally, even though I'm not a self, a much more personally engaged experience of trying to see the world differently, to be present in the world differently, to look at things differently, not just to sit there and say, in Christian tradition, I'm a sinner and I'm being saved by this outside agent. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody else here on this screen, I mean, Carolyn, are you like thinking the same thing or?
No, no. Actually, I am thinking of things like, um, even the prayer says, take away the sins of the world.
Right.
Okay. And I think of that as God within and my ability to internalize that and not suffer, to be at peace, to look at things differently. So to me, there is it meshes with how Jesus was, and we are trying to be like him. And so I don't see suffering. I see suffering as something that is happening, but it is up to us to be part of that energy that brings forth that overall loss of suffering in this world.
Mhm. Oh, I don't disagree with that. I was just talking about the traditional way that Christianity
I,
presents.
I know that a lot
Yeah.
of people, and they almost gravitate toward that as like that is acceptable, and
Mhm.
I have had sisters and priests and other religious who have moved us further toward the other way too. So
Mhm.
I do think it is something that we as a collective should positively influence.
Mhm. Yeah, and just tonight before we started this class, I was listening to the news, and Billy Graham Jr. Periodically gets on and does a commercial. Have any of you heard Billy Graham Jr. do these commercials? I don't know what channel I'm watching on, but he gets on and he reminds, say with me, we are all sinners and we need, your redemption and stuff. And you just, you realize that there are people listening to this kind of thing all the time.
Yes.
And it's not the same kind of self-generating, motivating, I'm not supposed to use the word self, but the kind of experience that you're talking about, Joshua, that that requires a person to look, um, to really look at the complexity of what it means to live in the world and respond to stimuli all around you, and then to kind of, you have you have the condition for the possibility of taking control of that. I guess that's a very basic distinction between what you're talking about. We have the condition of the possibility of taking control of that and doing something. In the traditional Christian understanding, sin has entrapped us so desperately that we have no no capacity for getting out of it. That's why we needed a redeemer to come and save us. And this is very, very different than that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm not, I don't have I'm just saying that as I listen to it, you just hear the clash. I hear the clash in my head. That's all. Clanging head.
Yeah. No, thank you to both of you. I mean, really, it's quite different, good, bad, or otherwise. I think some of the insights are really quite different.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. And we'll see. I mean, we'll talk a little bit next week, I hope, about monasticism, because one of both the fun things and the strange things about learning about Buddhism through college classes or a Zoom or at the meditation center is it's sometimes more available or feels like it could be integrated into our relatively individualistic society, regardless of any of our values in this group. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, there's a very long history in actual Buddhist communities that don't look that way. That in fact, in the demand of spending time with other human beings in ritually and hierarchically organized communities, we call them monasteries, is going to be necessary. We'll talk about this a little bit more, which is just to say, I'm not trying to diminish anyone's enthusiasm, which I think is wonderful. And I think there's some pieces that we are not seeing yet that I don't think we're going to dislike by any means. That's not the point at all. But a lot of Buddhist practice might look more institutionally religious than we expect because of the kind of ways that Buddhist ideas often appear to us, whether through meditation or a college class or something. So that's maybe a teaser. I don't know, a good one, a good teaser or a bad teaser, but I hope that we'll address at least a little bit of that next week.
Great. Anybody else? Well, I think it is time for us to say goodnight to Joshua. This is another good evening. Next week is our last session for this first semester, and then we look forward to the spring. So everyone have a very good evening. Last week we prayed as we ended for a resolution of the war and the suffering, especially in the Middle East, and things are beginning to move forward. So we just continue to pray that peace will reign and prevail and be lasting for everyone involved. Amen. Good night, everybody. See you next Thursday, okay? Bye.